I want to show you how much the percent modifiers matter on Warrior because it's not like any of the other classes. I want you to quickly realize I don't have single-minded Fury on because I'm going to be putting it on in a moment, and I'm currently in D stance, all right? This character I'm looking at sitting, so I know I'm going to get a crit the second I hit it. All right, look at that. Don't look at the white damage. Look at the yellow damage. You see that? A 17. Look again. It'll be a 17 or an 18. A 17. I'm going to go battle stance. It'll go up by 10% now. A 19, and we'll get like another 19. Now, I'm going to get some rage, and the reason I want to get rage is so that way I can then get my consume by rage effect up, and so I can show you how much higher we can get these things because it's super important to stack all of the buffs that you can. If you do not, you're going to have a really hard time actually doing good damage in raid, and it's not going to really matter how hard you want to try. See, so I'll activate this now too. Now I have way more percent modifiers, a whole bunch more. I still don't have all of them though, so make sure you remember that. Now we're going to hit this character again. They're going to sit down, and right now they're bleeding, but I don't want to distract you with those values. Okay, cool. There we go. 26. Oops, I still need to get the Consume by Rage activated. I hit him again. Let's see. 61. All right. 61. Now some of it is because there was the 26 in there, so really this is 35, all right? That's what it's actually ticking for. You're seeing 60s, but it's actually a 35. But notice how going from none of these buffs in D stance to all of these buffs, all meaning Consume by Rage, Single-Minded Fury, not being in D stance, and having Dark Moon buff, so not even having the Ashen Veil buff, I brought the damage of the bleed from 17 to 35. All right, it doubled the effect. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what's this really reflect on the rest of my character? Well, let's look at my character, which is quite geared. Now, you see this? My AP is giving me 29 DPS on my main hand. Then you go look at my actual full stat breakdown. It's 58 DPS on the main hand. Only half of my damage, and this is also messed up by the modifier, but only half of it is actually from the stats on my gear, so like strength attributes and such. The percent modifiers actually have a much larger difference. When I had all the stats and I hit them at the start of the video and you saw 17 bleeds, I had the same stats as now when I'm hitting the 35s, the 36s on the bleed. You got to remember that Warrior scales quadratically, and tiny differences are actually enormous because let's do some math. What would happen if you skipped out on the measly 5% damage modifier from Ashen Veil PvP? Would that be the end of the world? And I'll show you how it would be. So you'd be missing out on not just the 5%, but you have to remember how it impacts all the other effects that you're going to have. So you're going to have 10% from Dark Moon Fair, and let's say 10% from Single-Minded Fury, and another 20% from Consume by Rage. And when you multiply all of these percent enhancement effects, you're going to get a 45% enhancement output. But what we're wondering is how much higher would this have been if we had the 5% in? So let's add that in and redo the math really quick. And what you'll end up getting is a 152.5. So what's this mean? Well, that means that this would have had the difference in these two as the effect, which would have been 7.5%. And this is before we worry about warrior-specific things. This would be true on any class that had a 10% modifier, a second 10% modifier, and a 20%. And then you have the option of taking 5% or not. Now let's go into the warrior specifics. So you have auto attack damage, so auto, then you have moves, and then we can have deep wounds or side effects. Let's see. Let's talk about autos first. So if you have this buff, your auto will hit 7.5% harder. What's that going to mean? Well, definitely 7.5% more damage on the auto, which that's going to then translate to having 7.5% more abilities cast. And it's also going to translate to your deep wounds being 7.5% harder for the initial main hand hit. Okay, but that's just talking about autos. This doesn't just impact autos. It also directly impacts the moves and deep wounds. So we get to apply that a second time, which means that we don't just have 7.5 here. We have 7.5 squared. And we get the same thing over here. It's not just 7.5 there, it's 7.5 squared. So it's much more substantial. But this, of course, is going to leave you with the question of, well, how much of my damage is from the moves and deep wounds and how much is from auto attacks? And that's something that we can just go check. So let's see. Look at some of the number one parses. We can just check one of them. These guys all have very similar values, of course. And we'll just go check the most recent log. And we'll filter it by bosses. And let's see. So melee damage is only a fourth of Volando's DPS in this raid. Well, what would that mean for this raid if he decided not to have this buff? Well, autos would be 1/4. So 1/4 balance, and these would be 3/4. Okay. Well, let's see. So what's the difference between these two values? You have a 7.5 here, and here you have 7.5 squared, which is 15.5. Okay, so the difference is 8. So we need to have it be 3/4 to the right. So that means that instead of it being 15, it's going to be 15 minus 2, because that's 1/4 of 8. And so we'd have a 13.5% damage enhancement. This is what Alando would have had in this raid. If he decided, oh, I'm going to skip out on one buff, a 5% buff, then he would have done 13.5% less damage about. It probably would have been larger than this because there are other ways that these interact with each other, but that's just a starter. 13.5% when you thought it was 5. Imagine if you decide to skip out on a 10% buff. What if you found out that a 10% buff was like 30%? Don't skip any of the buffs. It'll make you have a really bad time in a raid.